No mic. There we go. Would the members in the audience please keep their voices down? I can hardly hear myself think. Rudy Yakum, do you have a special guest you'd like to recognize before we gavel in?
Sure. One of my best friends in the world, his name is Pete Russin. Pete spent the last 10 years as the chief architect at Tesla, designed every gigafactory globally for Tesla, and it's an honor to call him a friend, and it's an honor to have you here today. So thank you.
Very impressive. Welcome. Anybody else have a special guest? If not, the record will reflect that Dan Kildee was inside the chamber when I gavelled in, but not at his seat. Welcome, everybody. The committee will come to order. Today, we meet to mark up 5 bills aimed at improving the budget process, which is not being followed, not being enforced, and could use improvement, to say the least. And we've been working through the reforms to the budget process on a bipartisan basis. And I'm very pleased with now, if we pass those bills being considered today, we'll have a total of 11 budget process reforms thus far. The committee will consider today H.R. 8341, the Cost Estimates Improvement Act, led by our very own Mr. Tom McClintock, and then our colleagues Ed Case, Michael Cloud, Dan Muser, and Jared Golden. Also, H.R. 8195, the Strengthening Administrative Pay As You Go Act of 2024, and that has been led by our Oversight Task Force Chair, General Jack Bergman. H.R. 8372, the Debt Per Taxpayer Information Act. That's one that I introduced. Look forward to digging into that one. H.R. 8342, the Improper Payments Transparency Act, led by the pride of the Hoosier State, Rudy Yakum, and Jimmy Panetta from the Salad Bowl, who's not here, but will join, I know, because I know he wants to make comments about that. Scott Peters also, I'm sure, will be here, and Jack Bergman as well. H.R. 8343, finally, the Enhancing Improper Payment Accountability Act. All these in this order will be considered, and Blake Moore and Abigail Spanberger leading that last reform bill. I want to thank the ranking member, Mr. Boyle, who I think is under the weather, but I also want to extend my appreciation to Ms. Ilhan Omar, who is acting as ranking member today. And I want to thank all my colleagues for their contributions, again, to finding ways to improve the transparency, accountability, responsibility of this process of stewarding taxpayer dollars, which is a sacred trust. To ensure we have the flexibility to accommodate the schedule, I ask unanimous consent that the chairman be authorized to declare a recess at any time. The committee roll any request for roll call votes. Without objection, so ordered. Now, I'm going to yield myself 4 minutes, and I'm going to try to break a record here for me and speak just a couple of minutes, and then I'm going to ask Rudy Yakum, our chair of the Budget Process Reform Initiative, to spend a few minutes providing opening remarks as well. I have a constellation of a few things, Mr. Kildee, to restore fiscal responsibility. For me, one of those is reining in the deficit spending that is driving the unsustainable debt and that I think is out of control. But also to root out waste, which is, waste isn't a Republican or Democrat thing. It's a bad way to run a railroad, and it's not in keeping with our fiduciary responsibility. So we need to root out waste. We need to return to growth. We need a strong economy. I think that's the foundation here when we talk about strengthening the balance sheet, reducing our debt to GDP. We need to sound the alarm and wake the American people up. That debt clock keeps ticking, and I think because there isn't this calamitous effect, I think people are sort of lulled to sleep over it. And The problem is, once it happens and we lose the confidence of of those who we borrow from, who buy our treasuries, then we're going to be stuck with $2 trillion annually of a gap in what we spend on the people's government. So I worry that some sovereign debt crisis would really do a number on this country, our economy, our security, our leadership in the world. And that's why I think this budget committee is the most important committee in Congress, because if we don't do our job well, we will impact adversely anything and all things good about the United States and our government. Again, this has been a bipartisan effort, and there'll be times we disagree, even on budget process reforms. That's great, that's okay. I love the debate, I love the candor, I love the passion from both sides, but boy, do I respect the congenial and bipartisan spirit to try to find consensus where we can so that we can move our country forward. And that has been a commitment by my colleagues on both sides, and I'm grateful for that. So I guess to summarize the number of reform bills, I think each one of them in their own right, in one way or another, will work to ensure more fiscally responsible outcomes, provide more transparency for taxpayers, more accuracy for us as decision makers, and will increase accountability for lawmakers in the United States Congress, who again are in charge with the sacred trust of stewarding taxpayer dollars. And I know you all are committed to that. So I'm excited to dig into this, and God willing, have 11 reforms out there. And Rudy, I know you've got more to come. So Mr. Yocum, Mr. Chairman, I yield 3 minutes to you for your opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm happy to be here marking up these 5 important pieces of legislation today. These bills include common sense reforms that will establish greater transparency around the federal government's spending habits and work to root out waste and fraud found in the executive branch. I want to thank Mr. Bergman and Chairman Arrington for leading the Strengthening Administrative Pay-Go Act, which would require the executive branch to provide offsets for costly executive actions and administrative rules. President Biden's executive actions have cost over $2 trillion. The Nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office estimates that part of President Biden's student loan transfer scheme cost $260 billion. Overall, this kind of unchecked spending needs to stop. However, short of that, at a minimum, it needs to be offset, and this bill will help do just that. The Cost Estimate Improvement Act, led by Representatives Cloud, Case, Muser, Golden, and McClintock, would require the CBO to include debt servicing costs in all bill cost estimates. With interest payments on our debt rising at an alarming rate, it is critical that we know the full cost of a bill before it becomes law. The Debt Per Taxpayer Information Act, led by Chairman Arrington, will help create public awareness around the size of federal debt by including a figure showing the debt per taxpayer on our W-2 forms. Our current debt levels equate to over $200,000 per taxpayer, and it's important that the American people know and understand what that means on an individual basis. The Enhancing Improper Payments Accountability Act, led by Representatives Moore and Spanberger, would codify timely reporting requirements for federal programs that dispense over $100 million in payments annually. And finally, I'm proud to be leading the Improper Payments Transparency Act with Representatives Panetta, Bergman, and Peters. Our bill will require that the president's budget include specific data on rates of improper payments made by federal programs. How these improper payments compare to prior years and steps taken to mitigate these incorrect payments. Improper payments are wasteful, and we need to get serious on reining them in. I want to thank Chairman Arrington for your leadership on these vital issues and for holding this markup today. I look forward to supporting these bills, and I encourage my colleagues to do the same And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
I thank the gentleman from Indiana and now yield 5 minutes to our new acting ranking member and my colleague from Minnesota, Ms. Omar.
Thank you, Chairman. I strongly support bipartisan efforts to examine and reform the budget process. It has been more than 25 years since Congress passed all the appropriation bills on time. It is undeniable that there is work to be done to improve the budget process, and our committee's efforts have seen some success. We are incredibly proud, Mr. Chairman, that the CPO Data Sharing Act is moving through the Senate and that we all hope to see the President sign it into law soon. It is a sensible bill that will help the CPO better serve our institution, something we can all agree is a good thing. The Budget Committee has proven there is room for bipartisan problem solving in Congress, and I'm still ready and willing to work with my Republican colleagues on behalf of the American people. Unfortunately, the bills before the committee today are not a reflection of a productive bipartisan lawmaking. We have not held hearings on these issues, and yet Democrats are now being asked to vote for several bills which, if we are being honest with the public, do nothing to address the real fiscal problems we are facing. Instead of improving our budget process, today, budget Republicans are targeting the CPO with baseless partisan attacks and unnecessary legislation. Instead of finding ways to increase revenue or address tax evasion by the ultra-rich, we are entertaining legislation that does nothing but further the GOP's obsession with cutting programs that help working families. Instead of making it easier for Americans to pay their taxes, we are making it even more confusing by politicizing the information on our tax forms. None of that serves our constituents, but that's not surprising. From day one of this Congress, House Republicans' fiscal agenda has prioritized cutting vital government programs while protecting the ultra-wealthy tax cheats. The first bill House Republicans passed this Congress was to cut the IRS that would make it easier for billionaires and millionaires to cheat on their taxes. This hardly shows a commitment to improving program integrity or fiscal responsibility. Then they tried and failed to pass funding bills which attempted to take thousands of teachers out of the classrooms and slash food assistance for needy families. And when that did not work, they tried to pass an obscene 29% across-the-board cut to the federal budget, and then just their own speaker a day later. This is House Republicans' bleak vision for America. This is the same group who passed trillions in unpaid for tax cuts who would now have the American people believe they care about improper payments. But this is not about improper payments. It's about ruining the programs Americans rely on to justify future attempts at extreme cuts. So while Republicans have worked to rip the rug out under working families, Democrats have protected them from the most extreme mega policies. We voted time and time again to pass short-term funding bills that avoided costly government shutdowns. We defeated the Republican extreme cuts, instead came to the table on bipartisan funding legislation. And we provided the votes to end Republican bricksmanship and avert a devastating default on our nation's debt. So we are happy to talk about process. But let's not forget about our priorities. Democrats are willing to have a conversation about improper payments, but let's include revenue lost when millions of billion-dollar corporations and the ultra-wealthy cheat on their taxes. There are improvements to be made on our budget process, but a press release baseless claims that the CPO is working to re-elect President Biden isn't one of them. Let's look at the decades of failed trickle-down policies and unpaid tax cuts that got us here, rather than just the investments you don't like. As our former chair, John Yarmuth, told this committee some months ago, the problem is not the process, it's the people. No amount of process reform and CPO bills will absolve members of Congress of our responsibility to properly wield the power of the purse. I appreciate my colleagues on both sides of the aisle who co-sponsor these bills, and I look forward to hearing more about them. But no matter what additional process reforms we do or do not make, we must remain clear-eyed that actually solving our fiscal challenges will require more than one-party bills decided behind closed doors. Thank you again, Chairman.
Thank the gentlelady. The committee will now proceed to the consideration of H.R. 8341, the Cost Estimate Improvement Act, co-sponsored by our Budget Committee colleagues, Mr. Tom McClintock of California. This legislation would provide greater transparency by directing the CBO and the Joint Committee on Taxation to include debt servicing cost in its cost estimates for legislation. I ask unanimous consent that the first reading of the bill be dispensed with. The bill will be considered as read and open to amendment at any point, and that the reading of any amendments be dispensed with without objection, so ordered. Under the bipartisan agreement that I reached with Mr. Boyle, there'll be up to 15 minutes total for debate, evenly divided for the consideration of H.R. 8341. I now recognize my friend and colleague from the great state of Texas, Dr. Burgess, for 7.5 minutes, unless he yields his time.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I am extremely grateful that we're considering 8341 today. Is one of those budget reforms that seems so intuitively obvious to the casual observer, they can't believe that we're not already doing it. Anytime you purchase anything on credit or on time, the lender is supposed to give you a breakdown on what the cost of the financing actually is. But we don't do that at the level of the Congressional Budget Office. So this legislation establishes a mechanism for the Congressional Budget Office and the Joint Committee on Taxation to include the cost of servicing public debt in legislative cost estimates. In the first 7 months of this fiscal year, 2024, spending on net interest has reached over $500 billion, surpassing on both national defense and Medicare, according to the Committee for Responsible Budget. The Congressional Budget Office projects net interest on the debt will total $870 billion in 2024 and over $1.5 trillion in fiscal year 2034. Over the next 10 years, 50 cents of every dollar borrowed will go toward these payments. The debt continues to grow. Hardworking Americans will see more and more of their money going to debt servicing costs for which they get nothing in return. It is clear that the massive cost of servicing public debt poses an enormous threat to our economy. However, the costs of servicing public debt are not included in legislative cost estimates. This omission can lead to an incomplete assessment of a bill's financial impact, underestimating the true long-term cost to the taxpayers. Congress relies on the Congressional Budget Office and the Joint Committee on Taxation to provide objective and nonpartisan cost estimates in order to understand the financial implications of the proposed legislation. The exclusion of the associated interest costs that will incur as a result of the bill's implementation can lead to an incomplete assessment of the bill's financial impact. The Cost Estimates Improvement Act would amend the Congressional Budget Act of 1974 to require that any legislative cost estimate prepared by the Congressional Budget Office or the Joint Committee on Taxation, to the extent practicable, be included in the cost of debt servicing. This legislation would enhance the fiscal transparency by identifying the true cost of legislation and promote informed decision-making by providing more accurate and fulsome estimates of potential budgetary impacts of legislation, including the long-term interest cost. This would support lawmakers in considering the nation's long-term fiscal health in the legislative process. So certainly grateful to colleagues, Mr. Cloud, Mr. McClintock, Mr. Case, Mr. Muser, Mr. Golden, for their work on this legislation and their commitment to full fiscal transparency. I want to thank members for their support of this bill and look forward to its passage in the committee. Just before I yield back, Mr. Chairman, I would like to ask unanimous consent to submit record letters and statements of support from various organizations: Americans for Prosperity, BPC Action, Cato Institute, Committee for Responsible Federal Budget, Heritage Action Manhattan Institute, National Taxpayers Union Foundation, Peterson Solutions Fund, and the R Street Institute.
With that objection, so ordered.
And I will now yield my balance of my time back to the chair.
I thank the gentleman from Texas. I just want to reiterate a few points for everybody to mull over and to cogitate on, and that is the fact that our interest, which a few years ago, on the debt, was around $300 billion. It's being projected by CBO to be $870 billion, Jimmy. I think it'll be over $1 trillion. But regardless, it's the fastest growing expenditure item in the United States budget. And if it even sticks at $870 billion, it's more than we spend on Medicaid and more than we spend on our military. That should sober everyone up in the United States Congress as to one of the biggest debt drivers. And while it's $870 today, it's projected to be twice that amount, over $1.6 trillion in 10 years. So I think we may have different strategies and reform ideas to rein in the spending along with that, the deficit spending and the debt, the interest payments on the debt. But I think we all agree that this is a problem. And we ought to include that in the total cost, whether it's a Republican idea or a Democrat idea. We need accurate information, and the American people need full transparency on the cost of their government. And then we can make a decision with both eyes open and everything on the table. So I'm obviously wholeheartedly endorse this and would encourage my colleagues to do the same. And now yield, I think 7.5 minutes to the gentlelady from Minnesota.
Mr. Chairman, the CPO is already doing what this bill requires. CPO already publishes an interactive tool to calculate debt service, and staff already routinely use this tool as a part of our responsibility. For most legislation, the debt service impact would either be non-existent or negligible. For legislation with significant debt service impact, the chairman and the ranking member can and do request that CPO provide debt service impacts. CPO is releasing a report on June 21st, and that will address debt service impact in cost estimates. It is premature for the Budget Committee to legislate in advance of that report. The bill undermines the committee's authority by suggesting that budget leadership needs to legislate authority to get information from CPO. There is a study politicizing of CPO by this majority, including this week's press release that accused CPO of betting Biden's economic numbers. While I support efforts to improve CPO's work, including our CPO Data Sharing Act to strengthen CPO responsiveness to Congress's needs for cost estimates and reports, this bill is not the way to improve CPO. This bill is duplicative of what CPO is already doing, and I yield back.
I thank the gentlelady, and since there are no amendments, I now recognize the gentleman from Indiana, Mr. Yocum, for a motion.
Mr. Chairman, I move that H.R. 8341 be reported to the House with a recommendation that the bill do pass.
The questions on favorably reporting the bill, all those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. Do you like a recorded vote? No? Okay. Okay. Does somebody want a recorded vote? Does any committee member, colleague of mine, Republican, dear friend.
Mr. Chairman, I ask for a recorded vote.
You sure? Okay, I will yield to that request and call for a recorded vote. Pursuant to our bipartisan agreement that we've reached, we will postpone this recorded vote until later in the markup. I hope your friend goes back with a better impression, Rudy, of how efficiently we run this committee. The committee will now proceed to the consideration of 8195, the Strengthening Administrative Pay-As-You-Go Act of 2024, led by our Budget Committee colleague and Oversight Task Force Chairman, General Jack Bergman of Michigan. This legislation would clarify and permanently extend the Administrative Pay-As-You-Go Act, which was enacted in the Bipartisan Fiscal Responsibility Act last year. I ask unanimous consent for the first reading of the bill to be dispensed with. The bill will be considered as read and open to amendment at any point, and that the reading of any amendments be dispensed with without objection so ordered. Under the bipartisan agreement, we will have up to 15 minutes evenly divided to consider H.R. 8195, and I now recognize Mr. Jack Bergman, General Bergman from Michigan, for 7.5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and in the interest of time, brevity, and some of the things we don't do so well here, sticking to what is the problem that we're faced with. Simply stated, administrative pay-as-you-go, or pay-go, as it's commonly known, is a common-sense fiscal tool with a simple mission. If the executive branch intends to spend taxpayer dollars without Congress's approval, it must provide savings to offset the cost. However, despite the Bipartisan Fiscal Responsibility Act of 2023 renewing administrative pay-go, the Biden administration has opted to turn this measure into, at best, a lackluster budget exercise. Some might just say they're just ignoring congressional intent. So the solution, if you will, is this legislation corrects this, if you will, loosely defined misinterpretation by clarifying, fortifying, and permanently extending the administrative pay-go, reining in unchecked executive actions, and ensuring Congress can provide proper oversight. As I said a minute ago, President Biden has failed to uphold his end of the Fiscal Responsibility Act when it comes to enforcing administrative pay-go. 25 out of the 35 House Budget Committee members, including 11 of the 15 budget Democrats and 14 of the 20 budget Republicans, voted for the FRA. I ask unanimous consent to submit final vote results for the passage of the FRA.
Without objection, so ordered.
As our nation stares down an unprecedented debt crisis, reining in all forms of spending is more important than ever before. Since taking office, President Biden has proposed and implemented over $2 trillion worth of executive actions. I ask unanimous consent to submit a House Budget Committee analysis counting the cost of the President's executive actions since January of 2021.
Without objection, so ordered.
This spending was put forth by the Biden administration without, I repeat, without congressional approval. Administrative pay-go is a common-sense fiscal tool, as you've heard me say a minute ago, that has been employed on a bipartisan basis since 2010. I ask unanimous consent to submit administrative pay-go guidance from the Bush 43, Obama, and Trump administrations.
Without objection, so ordered.
All affirm administrative pay-go's purpose of budget neutrality. Its mission is simple. If the executive branch wants to spend taxpayer dollars without congressional approval, it must provide savings to offset the cost. That's not complicated. Unfortunately, this White House, under President Biden, immediately revoked administrative pay-go upon taking office. Again, I ask unanimous consent to submit an executive order from President Biden's first day in office in which he revoked administrative pay-go.
Without objection, so ordered.
The Biden administration has reneged on this measure's mission. He has turned administrative pay-go, again, into a kind of a squishy, lackluster, who knows, budget exercise that is unaccountable to Congress and the American people. Since passage of the FRA, the White House, Office of Management and Budget, has used its waiver authority for every qualifying rule. The Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget estimates that these waivers have increased 10-year deficits by at least $480 billion. Again, I ask unanimous consent to submit a press release from the CRFB highlighting this alarming estimate.
That objection, so ordered.
My bill, the SAP Act, addresses and corrects OMB's misinterpretation by ensuring administrative pay-go is properly implemented. Specifically, 1, the SAP Act increases the executive branch's transparency and accountability to Congress by 1, requiring OMB to notify the Budget Committee whenever administrative pay-go is waived and provide a cost estimate and waiver justification, and requiring the President's annual budget request to include the number of waivers granted during the previous fiscal year. 2, the SAP Act solidifies administrative pay-go's mission of promoting budget neutrality. CRFB stated that the SAP Act, quote, could prevent trillions of dollars of future borrowing. And 3, perhaps most importantly, the SAP Act eliminates administrative pay-go's original sunset date of December 31, 2024. It makes the provision permanent for all future administrations, regardless of political party. I would like to thank all of my fellow Budget Committee Republicans for all being original co-sponsors on this vital piece of legislation. With that, I yield back.
I thank the gentleman with the remaining time. Let me just say again, we're talking about rules that any president, Republican or Democrat, going forward would implement that cost $100 million a year or $1 billion over 10. $100 million a year. That's ceding the power of the purse if the executive does not offset that. I will be just as adamant that that is adhered to if there should be a President Trump, as much as I would hold fast to this under a Democrat president. This again shouldn't be partisan. We had previous administrations establish this and live under this principle and this rule. And the first day in office, I don't know if it was the first day, actually, but President Biden waived this. And I did hear from my ranking member and some of my colleagues during our budget resolution debate, a deal's a deal. And the discussion was around, do we consider the FRA numbers for our discretionary budget or the limit, save, grow? And it was a fair point that my Democrat colleagues made. A deal's a deal. You should include the FRA numbers, not limit, save, grow. But a deal's a deal. When we passed the FRA, we reinstituted and implemented this pay-as-you-go so that we didn't cede our Article I powers to the president. And this president, every time that rule would have applied, has waived it. And now we've got a whopping $2 trillion in cost to taxpayers in additional debt on account of his unilateral actions and failing to uphold the deal. So I thought that was worth mentioning. I'll now yield 7.5 minutes to my colleague from Minnesota.
Let's be honest, Mr. Chairman, this is a Republican messaging bill. Republicans drafted this bill on their own, introduced on their own, and used the bill as a platform to attack President Biden. OPM continues to comply with the FRA's admin pay-go provisions that Republicans negotiated with Democrats in the White House. The FRA was wide-ranging bipartisan agreement to raise the debt ceiling. 14 of the Republicans on this committee voted for the FRA. Policy concessions were made on each side, and part of the policy concessions to Republicans was the administrative pay-go. While the ink was still wet on the FRA, House Republicans backed away from the agreement and tried to unilaterally impose lower spending levels for FY24. This backing away nearly caused a government shutdown and led to appropriations being completed 174 days late. This is another selective reopening of the FRA by Republicans. If there were serious efforts to reopen FRA, Democrats would require an extension or reform of the debt ceiling, as well as future funding agreements that eliminate the risk of a shutdown. With that, I yield 3 minutes to Representative Scott from Virginia.
Thank you, and I appreciate the gentlelady from yielding. Mr. Chairman, you're right, a deal is a deal, and we ought to stick to the original agreement under the FRA. This is just reopening, as it's been said, is reopening the FRA, and if we're going to reopen it, we ought to reopen it all the way. This is just a way not only to attack President Biden, but to attack his policies. He's done a great deal under student debt. He's done a great deal under other issues where he has used administrative action on policy. And if you're going to attack the policy, but trying to do it through the back door with a method like this, I don't think you're not going to get away with it. We're going to continue doing the policy. We're going to continue sticking to the deal. OMB has complied with the FRA as it was agreed to, and we're going to continue helping students with their student debt and other issues that the president is going to be working on. So I hope that the bill does not pass, that we allow the president to maintain the authority he has under present law as agreed to in the Fiscal Responsibility Act, and I yield back.
I thank the gentleman from Virginia, and I want to just enter for the record, I won't rebut that, but just to say that we have a number of organizations, individuals who supported H.R. 8195. Those individuals and organizations include the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget, the National Taxpayer Union, Foundation for Government Accountability, American Action Forum, American for Prosperity, Cato Institute, Economic Policy Innovation Center, and Mr. David Schweikert, Vice Chairman of Joint Economic Committee. We appreciate Mr. Schweikert paying attention to what we're doing over here. And I'm not surprised either. Without objection so ordered, that's entered into the record. Again, I thank my colleagues for the indulgence there. We will now move on in this process. There are no amendments that I'm aware of. I recognize the gentleman from Indiana. Now, Mr. Yocum for a motion.
Mr. Chairman, I move that H.R. 8195 be reported to the House with the recommendation that the bill do pass.
The questions on favorably reporting the bill, those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed?
No.
In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. Mr. Chairman? Yes. Well, I will grant that request, and pursuant to our agreement, we'll just roll that roll call vote to later in the markup. Committee now will proceed to the consideration of H.R. 8372, the Debt per Taxpayer Information Act. This legislation would educate and inform Americans about our nation's current fiscal health vis-a-vis the national debt, by providing data on the federal budget, on their W-2, and requiring the president's budget request and congressional budget resolution to include crucial financial data such as estimates on the amount of debt per taxpayer. I ask unanimous consent that the first reading of the bill be dispensed with, the bill be considered as read, and open to amendment at any point, that the reading of the amendment be dispensed with without objection so ordered. Under the bipartisan agreement that I've reached with Mr. Boyle, again, we'll be debating 15 minutes, 7.5 for each side. I yield myself such time as I may consume, and happy to yield to any of my colleagues. Here are my thoughts on making sure that every taxpayer in the country understands how much of the debt that person owes, and their share of the debt, to make it more personal as opposed to this $34 trillion in the debt clock that keeps ticking away. I think one of our most important responsibilities is to somehow create the sense of urgency and raise the awareness with the American people about this unsustainable debt trajectory that we're on and the consequences that could unfold if we were to have a debt-related crisis. Again, I think we're all numb to the debt clock. But if we were to have taxpayers open up their W-2 and see what their share of the debt is, and at this point, the debt per taxpayer is a little over $200,000, just maybe we would have our fellow American citizens engage all the more, ask questions, have conversations at the water cooler at work or at the kitchen table. And when we go do our town halls, maybe those will be, that the questions will include, why am I now paying $200,000 in the debt that I owe? I would submit to my colleagues that most likely it won't be the taxpayers today that will pay for our debt. It will be a deferred tax on our children. Americans under the age of 18 actually owe almost $500,000 of the share of debt per child, per adolescent, per young adult. I don't think most young people in this country are aware of the significant burden and potential catastrophic consequence that will occur if we continue down this path. They will either be robbed of their opportunities in this great country, they will suffer under tremendously high taxes, very painful, austere cuts, or even worse. They will live in a country unlike we lived, where the United States, because we jeopardized our economy and security, we're no longer the leader of the free world. And I can't think of a worse thing we could do as leaders to be the first generation to hand the country worse than we found it. I know we can do better than that, and I know colleagues on both sides of the aisle here agree. Again, this is just a way to raise the awareness and create a sense of urgency and a conversation with the American people. Abraham Lincoln said that without public sentiment, you can't do anything in this business. But with public sentiment, you can do anything. So we have a lot of conversations that we need to have, and some very serious and sober conversations with the American people. I think this will create that dynamic, and I think that's a healthy thing. There are probably other ways to do it. By the way, we passed the fiscal state of the nation. That was a bipartisan initiative that would also raise the awareness of this and create dialogue in our country over our unsustainable debt. With that, I yield to the gentleman from Georgia for as much time as he may consume of what time is remaining.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I rise in support of this. I think that it's important to know what our obligations are. I want you to think about the reality of living in your hometown. And do you really wake up every day and care what your neighbor's mortgage payment is going to be? Whether or not that they have $1 million debt on their house, $500,000, $200,000, or $10 million? Do you really care what your neighbor's car payment is going to be? And do you really care what your heating and air bill is going to be? Okay, and the answer is no, because it's not your business, right? And so if all of a sudden you got a bill for your neighbor's debt, you would care deeply about this, right? And so that is exactly where we're going with this, is that people all too often don't know what burden has been placed on them because the collection man hasn't come calling yet. But the collection man will come calling, and our fellow Americans are going to want to know, where in the world did this bill come from? Well, with this piece of legislation, it would in fact alert people to what their obligation is going forward. If you're a family of 4, you're talking about $800,000 a year. If you're a family of, with 6, you're talking about 1.2 million. That is an enormous awakening moment. So let's just make sure that Americans know the burden that's been placed upon them. And then I think the awareness of the fiscal state of our nation will come up. Again, you don't really care about your neighbor's mortgage payment, but you care deeply about your own. And you can only care about that if you know about it. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
I want to make clear, we're not laying blame on Democrats or any particular president, political party on the W-2. We're not just sending the W-2 debt per taxpayer to Republicans, we're sending it to all Americans. I think the conversation is essential, and I think each member of Congress and each party can follow up in that conversation with how they plan to address it. And I think as we pass this bipartisan debt commission, all things are on the table for that discussion. But the discussion has to happen, or we won't bring the American people along, and it may be too late by the time we have that conversation. And that's my biggest fear. So I think this is straightforward, common sense, and I think it will. I think it's a responsible thing to do to raise the awareness. With that, I yield 7.5 minutes to the gentlelady from Minnesota.
I won't take up 7.5 minutes. We have concerns with the bill as it's structured. We plan to make amendments that we will soon offer that will make some sensible changes. We believe that we shouldn't just show citizens one side of the budget, that we should talk about the investments and services that they are also receiving. And I look forward to the amendment debate, and hopefully we can all work together to address these concerns, and I yield back.
I thank the gentlelady. Are there any amendments at the desk? Mr. Scott.
I have an amendment at the desk.
Clerk will designate the amendment. The staff will distribute the copies of the amendment. We'll just pause for just a couple minutes.
An amendment to strike Section 3 being offered by Mr. Scott.
Mr. Chairman,
Mr. Yocum.
I reserve a point of order.
The gentleman from Indiana reserves a point of order. Mr. Scott, the gentleman from Virginia now has 4 minutes to speak on the amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, this amendment just strikes unnecessary information which would only serve to politicize the process, and it strikes that language. Chairman, you've mentioned the fact that you need how people get involved. I think there's another quote that an informed electorate is important for a functioning democracy, and this information that I'm striking isn't good information. It's unnecessary, misleading information. It suggests that everybody owes exactly the same amount of money, and that's not true. We have a progressive taxation system where it's based on the ability to pay. So if billionaires are paying their fair share, they would be paying a higher portion of that debt than everybody else. The administrative burden on the IRS, have got to calculate that and have it ready for the W-2 forms if this amendment is not adopted. And so this amendment just simply takes away unnecessary language. And I just point out, Mr. Chairman, that talking about the debt doesn't reduce the debt. We have a lot of work to do that we should be doing, not just talking about it. So I'd hope that the amendment would be adopted, and I yield back the balance of my time. Mr. Chairman, is the gentleman going to insist on his point of order?
Does the gentleman insist?
I do insist.
He insists, Mr. Scott.
Well, Mr. Chairman, I'm advised that this amendment is actually within the purview of the Ways and Means Committee and therefore subject to a point of order. But it seems to me the whole bill is in the Ways and Means Committee, so I don't know why my amendment is any worse than the bill itself. But having said that, I understand the parliamentarian has an opinion on it, and I'll be on the losing end of that, so I'll withdraw the amendment.
Well, I appreciate the gentleman withdrawing his amendment. I would add that we passed a resolution out of this committee under the leadership of all of my colleagues, not just me, and that resolution would reduce the deficit by $14 trillion. So we have taken action. We didn't get support from our Democrat colleagues. I understand they have their own ideas. But I just want people to understand, we need to have the conversation because of democracy, as you mentioned. I say amen to that. But we have taken steps. And you're right. At the end of the day, actions are going to speak louder than words, and we're going to have to take action. And on the most important things, bipartisan action. So thank you, Mr. Scott. Are there any other amendments?
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will designate the amendment. The staff will distribute the copies of the amendment. We'll pause for just a minute.
An amendment to add additional information in the president's budget and congressional budget being offered by Ms. Omar.
Let's just make sure we got everybody. Is he gonna? You might tap him on Okay, the gentlelady from Minnesota is recognized for 4 minutes to speak on her amendment.
This amendment will bring a balanced approach to the type of information provided in the underlying bill. The chairman's bill only examines federal liabilities but does not really consider the asset side of the balance sheet or the long-term benefits from spending. My amendment includes additional information on federal total financial asset, net liabilities, and federal investments. Including information on federal assets and investments will present a more comprehensive view of the budget. While debt held by public is a key measure, it provides incomplete information on the government's financial condition. The U.S. government holds a significant financial asset which can be offset against debt held by public and other financial liabilities to achieve a more complete understanding of our country's fiscal health. The fiscal year 2023, the federal total financial asset net of liabilities were around $2.5 trillion. Furthermore, public spending can yield long-term benefits for the economy and greater society than if that money had been solely allocated in the private sector. It promotes improved efficiency within federal agencies as well as government growth in the nation's economy by increasing the overall stock of capital. Investment spending can take the form of direct federal spending or grants to state, local, tribal, or territorial governments. It can be designated for fiscal capital, a tangible asset that increases production over a period of years or increases value of the government. It can also be used for research and development, education, or training, all of which are intangible, but can still increase income in the future or provide other long-term benefits. In fiscal year 2023, federal investments was approximately $536 billion. With the bill as currently drafted, Republicans again take a one-sided approach to deficit reduction by only focusing on spending. I hope the committee will accept this amendment to provide a more informative and a clearer picture of the government's fiscal capacity and condition. With that, I yield back.
I thank the gentlelady. You have 4 minutes to myself, and if any of my colleagues want to comment, I'll keep mine short. the more information, the clearer the picture, the better for the American people. I'm not trying to hide the ball. I don't think anybody is in this process. I think we're just trying to make sure that the American people understand on a personal level what the fiscal health of their country is and their share in that. And to include assets along with liabilities makes sense to me. I have no problem with it. And I would urge my colleagues to support this amendment. I'll certainly be supporting it. And I appreciate the gentlelady, her contributions to making it improved and bipartisan, which gives it the best chance of actually becoming the law of the land, which is, I think, what we all want. So grateful. I've got 3 minutes remaining. If anybody has a comment, I'm happy to defer. But without any such interest from my colleagues, I will now move to the question on agreeing to the amendment. All those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. Since there are no further amendments, I now recognize the gentleman from Indiana, Mr. Yocum, for a motion.
Mr. Chairman, I move that H.R. 8372, as amended, be reported to the House with the recommendation that the bill do pass.
The questions on favorably reporting the bill as amended, all those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. Would anybody like a recorded vote? It's okay.
Mr. Chairman, I do request that we have a
Okay, your
recorded vote.
request is granted. Pursuant to our agreement, we're going to roll the votes to the end of the markup. Committee's now going to proceed to the consideration of H.R. 8342, the Improper Payments Transparency Act, led by Budget Committee's Process Reform Task Force Chairman, Mr. Yocum. Among others, Mr. Bergman, and then our colleagues, Mr. Jimmy Panetta and Mr. Scott Peters as well. This legislation would correct gaps in improper payment reporting by requiring the president's budget to include key data on fiscal waste, fraud, and abuse within executive branch agencies. I ask unanimous consent that the first reading of the bill be dispensed with. The bill will be considered as read, open to the amendment at any point. The reading of any amendments be dispensed with. Without objection, so ordered. Under the bipartisan agreement, again, there'll be 15 minutes of debate, equally divided to consider H.R. 8342. Now I recognize the lead sponsor of this bill, Mr. Yocum of Indiana, for 7.5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, I ask unanimous consent to submit into the record letters and statements of support from various organizations and individuals as a part of H.R. 8342.
Without objection, so ordered.
Thank you. Thank you for the time, Mr. Chairman, for calling this bill up for a hearing. Improper payments are a blatant waste of taxpayer dollars, and we need to prioritize taking steps to fully understanding the size and scope of these errant payments. I'm proud to be leading the Improper Payments Transparency Act with my colleagues, Representative Panetta, Bergman, and Peters, which would require the President's budget request to include program-by-program data on improper payments, including amounts and rates, 3-year averages, and steps being taken to mitigate improper payments. Since 2003, the federal government has made over $2.7 trillion of improper payments. According to the Government Accountability Office, or GAO, in fiscal year 2023 alone, an estimated $236 billion of improper payments was made. That is completely unacceptable. Digging deeper into the GAO data, 74% of the $236 billion of improper payments were due to overpayments. 17% of federal pandemic unemployment insurance assistance payments were overpayments. Upwards of 33% of earned income tax claims are improper. I'm a businessman by background, and I can tell you that no business would survive allowing 33% of its payments to be overpayments. Taxpayers expect more from their government, and we as members of Congress should too. We must never forget that every dollar collected through taxes is a dollar that hardworking Americans don't get to put towards feeding their families, buying a home, or saving for retirement. I know the Hoosiers I represent definitely want us to start spending more wisely. An easy way to do that is to put an end to improper payments. For us to get improper payments under control, we need to understand the full scope of the problem and the current efforts being made by federal agencies to correct these errant payments. This bipartisan bill will do just that. I urge my colleagues to support this common sense bipartisan bill, and I yield the balance of my time to my friend, Mr. Lloyd Smucker from Pennsylvania.
Thank you to Mr. Kim. I just want to mention as well my support for this bill. This is great bipartisan good governance legislation that'll provide greater transparency and accountability in executive branch spending. According to GAO, improper payments are payments that should have not been made in the first place or were made in the incorrect amount. In 2023, 14 agencies reported a total of $236 billion in improper payments across 71 government programs, which, by the way, that's spending more on improper payments than on the U.S. Army. Improper payments can crowd out funding for other programs and activities and can obstruct federal dollars from reaching those who truly need them. They can also leave vulnerable beneficiaries owing the government tens of thousands of dollars from unknowingly receiving improper payments. Making matters worse, the true extent and effects of improper payments are unknown because, according to the GAO, the government lacks complete, reliable, or accurate estimates, which this bill intends to fix. The legislation corrects gaps in improper payment reporting by requiring the inclusion of key data in the president's budget requests, such as a description of programs required to submit improper payment reports, a detailed explanation of why any improper payments occurred, trends in improper payment amounts and rates over a 3-year period, what corrective actions agencies are taking to reduce improper payments, and the status of those actions. Given that improper payments are a significant driver of deficit spending and the federal debt, clear and comprehensive information should be reported to Congress annually. Expanding data reporting requirements will compel government programs to identify and examine barriers to information gathering. Providing that information in the President's budget request will help both agencies and Congress identify the root causes and continue to reduce improper payments. Expanding data reporting requirements will compel government programs to begin to identify and examine barriers. They all should be doing better. A greater emphasis on improper payments in the President's budget will highlight the immense threat they pose to the fiscal state of the nation in the executive branch's ultimate budgetary document. Improper payments are the definition of waste, fraud, and abuse, and this bill will support work to reduce and ultimately prevent them. And with that, Mr. Chairman, if there's additional time, I'd like to yield time to Mr. Estes.
Remaining the time is Mr. Estes.
Well, thank you for yielding. Obviously, talking about improper payments is so important, and I thank you, Mr. Chairman, for including the Improper Payments Transparency Act in today's markup. This is a great bipartisan piece of legislation, and you know, we hear over and over again about the debt and the deficit and where it's continuing to grow. And obviously, if the money that the federal government is entrusted with to spend on the programs that we support is spent incorrectly, then we need to make sure that those problems are resolved and addressed, and we move forward. As mentioned before, just the billions of dollars in improper payments obviously takes away from the ability to provide those goods and services that we want to focus on. And it also, you hear over and over of the burdens that are placed on individuals who may have inadvertently received a payment and the pressure that they're put under to return that and the struggle that they have to go through that. So it's so important that we focus on how do we address these issues, make sure that we're providing good government, and good government's making sure that we're good stewards of the taxpayers' money. And just by definition, improper payments show waste, fraud, and abuse, and this bill is going to work to reduce and ultimately prevent that and the misuse of these funds. So with that, Mr. Chairman, I thank you for bringing this bill up, and I'll yield back.
I think the gentleman from Kansas, 45 seconds. I want to reiterate again, this is now the 6th largest expenditure item in the federal government. Waste isn't a Republican thing or a Democrat thing. It is a taxpayer fiduciary responsibility for us to root it out. And listen, this is not about entitlement reform. We can debate that. Assume we have differences of opinions on entitlement reform. This is about getting at the waste, the money that should go to beneficiaries who are entitled according to the laws of the land. And this cost has risen over 20 years by $2.7 trillion. I mean, the total cost. And over the last 10 years, it's gone up 133%. If I'm correct, there have been Republican and Democrat presidents and administrations and Congresses in that time span. So this has increased over the years under Republican-controlled Congress and under Republican leadership in the White House and under Democrat. Let's get after the waste and reduce the $240 billion a year. Over 10, it's larger than Russia's economy. Guys, this is unacceptable. Let's get after this with bipartisan, good old American fervor and bring that down once and for all and not just talk about it, as Mr. Scott said. With that, I yield 7.5 minutes to the gentlelady from Minnesota.
Thank you, Chairman. I support reducing improper payments. However, this bill does not accomplish that goal. It largely requires agencies to report in the President's budget information that they are already required to report under the Payment Integrity Information Act of 2019. Despite our signing on to a bipartisan budget initiative, the committee has not had any hearings, fact-finding, discussions, or bipartisan proposals to address substantive budget issues or improper payments. We should hold substantive hearings to examine this issue before rushing legislation. Instead of requiring OMP to put the same information in multiple places, we should let them build upon their success of reducing improper payments. Excluding three-time pounded pandemic relief programs that were designed, implemented, and overwhelmingly administered at the onset of the pandemic in 2020, the fiscal 2023 improper payment rate was 4.3%, the lowest level since 2014. One amendment defines improper payments to include taxes owed but not collected and requires reporting on the tax gap and measures to close it. Republicans again take a one-sided approach to deficit reduction by blaming spending for our fiscal outlook. Republicans refuse to address the $625 billion tax gap, money that directly adds to our deficit. A second amendment requires reporting on the improper payments focused on seniors by Big Pharma's inflated drug prices and the savings generated from drug price negotiations included in the Inflation Reduction Act. For far too long, Americans have paid more for prescription drugs than any major economy. Congress should be informed about how the implementation of the Inflation Reduction Act's drug provision lowers health care costs for American families and reduces the federal deficit by ending exorbitant price gouging by Big Pharma. With that, I yield 3 minutes to Representative Panetta from California.
Outstanding. Thank you, Ranking Member, and thank you, Mr. Chairman. Obviously, I'm proud to lead this co-lead this legislation with my good friends and colleagues here on this committee and in Congress, Representatives Yackham, Peters, and of course, General Bergman. I appreciate what the Ranking Member had to say, and I think there's some legitimate points there. But I think the fact is that we got to get on this sooner rather than later, because over the last 2 decades, this federal government, our federal government, has reportedly made over $2.7 trillion in improper payments. And these types of mistakes accumulate, and they underscore the need for enhanced transparency and accountability measures. The Improper Payments Transparency Act is a crucial step in this direction that clearly I think we need to go in. The legislation requires detailed reporting on improper payments to facilitate better oversight and corrective action. Further, the bill will specifically mandate that any critical information on improper payments be included in the President's annual budget request. This is going to include program descriptions, explanations for improper payments, trend analysis, and corrective actions taken by an agency. Now, as we've talked about in this committee, and some of us have talked about it outside of this committee, our nation's debt is nearing 35 trillion. 35 trillion. And any action that we can do to curb wasteful spending will help restore our fiscal responsibility. I think it's, like I said, a first step, a big step in the right direction. And addressing these types of improper payments is kind of low-hanging fruit. I say that because these types of payments shouldn't have even left government coffers in the first place. This legislation, as we've heard, has bipartisan support, but it also has broad support both on this committee and from organizations concerned with the national debt and good governance. Increasing transparency and reporting on these payments will enable us, as my good friend Ron and my Ways and Means member Ron Estes said, will enable us to be better stewards of taxpayer dollars. It's a bill that is common sense and will empower us to reduce waste and allocate resources effectively. And that's exactly why I support it and ask my colleagues to support it as well. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
I thank the gentleman from California. There are 2.5 minutes remaining. If anybody else wants to talk, or are you going to yield it back, ranking member? Okay. Okay.
Yield it back.
Okay. Well, I thank the gentleman from California and everybody involved for their leadership. It's a lot harder when you're in the minority to lean into finding consensus and being willing to work across the aisle for bipartisan solutions. And I'm always grateful to my friend and Ways and Means colleague, Mr. Panetta, for that. The amendments considered by the committee will be those submitted pursuant to the bipartisan agreement made by me and the ranking member, Mr. Boyle. The debate time for each amendment will be limited to 8 minutes, equally divided. Are there any amendments?
I have amendment. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will designate the amendment. Staff will distribute copies of the amendment, and we'll give it 1 minute to make sure everybody's got a copy.
An amendment on adding tax gap data to the president's budget being offered by Ms. Omar.
Okay, so you. The gentlelady from Minnesota is now recognized for 4 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman. This amendment will provide some important level setting on the improper payments by including tax fairness issues. My amendment would require the president's budget to include information on the size of the tax gap. It would also consider the marginal returns on investments from additional spending on tax enforcement and policies that would improve tax fairness and reduce the deficit. Most importantly, the amendment requires agencies reporting on underpayments or the lack of any payment to include tax receipts. It just makes sense. Taxes that are owed but not collected are a form of improper payments. This must be addressed. Billions of dollars in taxes owed under current law are never paid because of evasion, contributing to a tax gap that has created $625 billion hole in the deficit. The majority of the owed taxes are from the top 1%. These figures become even larger and more disheartening when you consider the historic disinvestment in the IRS capacity to collect the revenue that is owed and the years of tax cuts for the wealthy and corporations. The IRS is currently not able to collect 15% of the taxes that are owed because of understaffing. Estimates suggest that the increased tax enforcement funding for the IRS would reduce the deficit by over $100 billion. Additionally, the Bush tax cuts, their extensions, and the Trump tax cuts have been estimated to add $10 trillion to the national debt. Without these tax cuts, our federal debt would remain at a sustainable level forever. Billionaires should not be paying lower effective tax rates than working-class Americans. Billionaires' minimum income tax would require that the top 0.01% of earners pay at least 25% in taxes on their full income, including unrealized appreciations. Estimates suggest that this kind of proposal would raise over $400 billion across the decade. Corporations should also be paying their fair share and must prioritize people over profits. Returning the top corporate tax rate to 28% would bring corporate tax revenue as a share of the economy to approximately the 21st century average before 2017 tax law. Estimates suggest that increasing the corporate tax rates to 28% will raise $1 trillion over the decade. Ultimately, focusing only on costs and not revenue in improper payments is one-sided and insufficient. Our colleagues on the other side of the aisle are eager to talk about fiscal responsibility, but there is no being fiscally responsible without including revenues as a solution. There is nothing more fiscally irresponsible than refusing to enforce the laws on the books and bring in substantial revenue that the government is owed to provide strong public goods and innovative programs for our communities. I urge my colleagues to vote yes on this amendment and to support equitable tax policy centered on public interest and not corporate interests. And I yield back.
I thank the gentlelady from Minnesota. Now yield to the gentleman from Indiana, 4 minutes. Mr. Yocum.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I urge my colleagues to oppose this amendment. This amendment extends way beyond the original scope and intent of this legislation. This bill is aimed at gaining more fuller understanding of the extent of improper payments and what the federal agencies are doing to mitigate its errant spending. Instead, this amendment shifts the focus to tax policy and enforcement. It's not in enforcement, but complete broadening of that risks diluting our objectives. Additionally, this amendment is redundant as it seeks to add reporting requirements for underpayments which are already part of the legislation. It's also important to note that the bulk of improper payments are overpayments, not underpayments. It attempts to make a very bipartisan piece of legislation and take it and inject purely partisan proposals into it. We've worked very hard to make this a balanced and bipartisan piece of legislation that will contribute to tackling this important issue. Overall, it's an unnecessary amendment that achieves no new goals and instead inserts partisan issues into a strong bipartisan bill and effort. For those reasons, I oppose this amendment and I urge my colleagues to vote no. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I'd like to yield the balance of my time to my friend from Georgia, Mr. Ferguson.
I'd like to thank the gentleman. Mr. Chairman, I'd like to speak in opposition to this amendment. First of all, it's like socks on a rooster. It just doesn't fit on this bill. Okay, these things do not line up. This is not the proper place for this. So that's number one. Number two, I feel like we got to have a reality check on some of the gentlelady's comments. First of all, we need to recognize that in America, we shouldn't be trying to be on par with the rest of the world. We should be ahead of the rest of the world in competitiveness on our tax rate, corporate rate, everything that we do. We need to be making sure that America is the single most competitive place in the world to do business, and we should not be apologetic about it. Secondly, if we raise the corporate rate, then we are going to take away from companies' ability to pay their workers higher wages, to make investments in research and development, and to make sure that they are competitive on the global stage. I don't want to be on par with the rest of the world. I want us to win day in and day out. It's important for America to do that. We are the world's center of innovation, creativity, and if we don't do that, if we raise the corporate rate, we are going to hamstring American companies in their ability to grow this economy, discover new things, and to pay American workers higher and higher wages. That's number one. Number two, I think we need to look at the reality of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act and look at the revenue streams that have been produced since its inception. Clearly, there was a dip the very first year, but once companies adopted these policies and they went into effect, we have had the highest revenues coming into the federal government year in and year out that we have ever had. Year in and year out, the Treasury has taken in more money from American business because of productivity and because of the work that they're doing. And by the way, because we equalized the international side of this, Mr. Chairman, we have seen trillions of dollars flow in from around the world into America to do research and development here, and quite candidly, into our Treasury. And finally, when I hear people talking about that billionaires should pay the same effective tax rate as everybody else, sure, they should. But going after their wealth, I think is 100% anti-American. From an income standpoint, absolutely. But to go after and tax their wealth is, number one, it's going to leave America in a less competitive position, and it's going to stifle investment down the road. So I rise in opposition to that, and Mr. Chairman, I yield my time back.
I thank the gentleman from Georgia. The question is on agreeing to the amendment. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, no. No. In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it. The amendment is not agreed to.
I ask for a roll call.
Recorded vote is requested pursuant to the agreement. We will postpone this recorded vote until later in the markup. Are there other amendments? Ms. Schakowsky. Ms. Schakowsky has an amendment at the desk. Can we just pause for 1 minute, Ms. Schakowsky, and let everybody get a copy? And then I will yield you 4 minutes.
An amendment on improper payments in prescription drug markets being offered by Ms. Schakowsky.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yes, I do have an important amendment to offer that I think can address the issue of government spending and overpayments. It seems to me that while this legislation wants to target places that we should be able to gain more money and stop some of the excessive spending, and yet I think one of the most important places that we could look, and Representative Omar mentioned them in the past, is Big Pharma, which is absolutely price gouging Medicare on drug costs. Americans pay far more than any people around the world for drugs, and particularly for their brand name prescription drugs. We see that Americans pay as much as 5 times as more than people around the country for the exact same drugs. We are just acting as a bunch of chumps here in the United States and allowing Big Pharma to get away with that. And, you know, if you just look at the amount of money that drug pricing, that the CBO says that drug pricing negotiation is absolutely going to lower the costs of government to the tune of $235 billion over 10 years. So why would we leave this thing behind? We absolutely should be saying that the drug pricing that we able to negotiate for that. And also that we are lowering the costs for insulin, which is so important, and that's another cost then that we don't have to incur. And so it seems to me that we could do ourselves well by doing an examination of all those kinds of things that actually are creating more revenue, reducing costs, helping consumers, and that is something we want to do. So I urge all my colleagues to support this legislation. And now I would like to leave time for Mr. Espaillat for his remarks.
Thank you. Thank you, Representative. I rise in support of this amendment. It holds pharmaceutical companies accountable, and frankly, the Inflation Reduction Act had a profound and positive effect on many Americans precisely because the pharmaceutical companies were out of control. And the $35 cap on insulin alone in my district, Mr. Chairman, has benefited over 10,000 Medicare beneficiaries, and more than 4,000 residents will save an average of $1,400 in medical premiums. These savings have been life-changing for many Americans. In fact, they've saved their lives, and it's unfortunate that many have had to wait so long to be able to afford the necessary medicines that they need. And so this amendment holds the pharmaceutical companies' feet to the fire. And there's still so many more people who have to decide to between taking medication or putting food on their table or paying rent. This amendment holds, again, the pharmaceutical industry accountable. Americans deserve to see how the extreme prices are hurting the economy and impacting negatively on their health. The result, in many cases, is a simple word: death. And so let's support this amendment.
Thank the gentleman from New York, and now yield 4 minutes to the gentleman from Indiana, Mr. Yacob.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I oppose this amendment because it ignores the definition of improper payments and instead tries to shift the bill's focus. This bill is focused on rooting out waste, fraud, and abuse in government programs. The amendment looks to continue the Democrats' crusade against innovative companies that develop new cures and treatments improving the lives of all Americans. This amendment tries to continue the false narrative that the Inflation Reduction Act's drug price controls are benefiting Americans, while the facts show different. The IRA's drug price controls are negatively impacting innovation for treatment options aimed at combating some of the most devastating illnesses impacting Americans. We've seen countless companies sacrifice research and development to offset government price setting. We all know fostering innovation is key to driving down healthcare costs, and we should encourage policies that do just that. There's a time and a place to have an honest and thoughtful debate over how to lower drug prices in the U.S., whether it be through bipartisan reforms House Republicans have led on, or the socialist government price controls Democrats included in the IRA. However, today, nor this bill are either the time or the place to have this debate. This amendment is solely a distraction from reining in wasteful government spending. A vote for this amendment is a vote to distract from the issue of improper payments and further attack American medical innovation. I urge no vote on this amendment. And with that, I yield the balance of my time to Mr. Peters.
Thank you. I thank gentlemen for yielding. Our Improper Payments Transparency Act will ensure future presidents' budget requests include more detail on the scale of improper payments. This will help us better understand what corrective actions agencies are taking and what more we can do to stop improper payments. The Government Accountability Office defines improper payments as, quote, payments that should not have been made or were made in the incorrect amount. Many believe that drug costs have been too high for too long, but this amendment is beside the point. I don't know, roosters with socks. I don't understand that reference, Mr. Ferguson, but this is
That was a reference to me. That was a reference to me in running
Come to Georgia and
sports.
you'll get, and we can explain it a little better.
But we should have those conversations in the Energy and Commerce Committee. This is about whether, whatever the price is, you've mispaid the amount, and I think we should stick to that. And Democrats, by the way, I disagree with Mr. Yacob. Democrats should be proud to talk about the IRA and what we did for the first time to allow the negotiation of prices with drug manufacturers for us to lower the cost of insulin, as Mr. Espiat mentioned. I just think that's a different conversation, so I will vote no on this amendment, and I yield back.
Mr. Yonkum, you still have time remaining. I think the gentleman from Georgia may be requesting time.
I will yield to the gentleman from Georgia.
Thank you. And, Mr. Chairman, I speak in opposition to this, and my dear friend from California may not understand socks on a rooster, but you might understand a lost ball in the high weeds, which is exactly what this amendment is. It really, it's lost. It doesn't belong on this bill. But I think I look at our healthcare system today and I ask three questions. Compared to 14 years ago, are we more healthy, or do Americans have better utilization of the system? And are prices lower? The answer to every single one of those is no. And in the category of drug pricing, what we are not doing and what we're not facing, we are pointing a finger at drug manufacturers, something that is really important to not only this nation but around the world, whether it's something dealing with the pandemic or whether it's with AMR. We have to continue to invest in pharmaceutical research. It is vitally important to the health of this nation. But if you really want to get at the root cause of the problem, maybe we should look at the incestuous relationship between insurance companies, PBMs, and pharmacies. Look at the vertical integration that is occurring there and the perverse incentives that exist for drug pricing in that system. And look, if you want to go after pharmaceutical companies for making too much money, maybe we should look under the hood of this vertically integrated payer system that is breaking the backs of American families every single week. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
I thank the gentleman from Georgia. The question is on agreeing to the amendment. All those in favor say aye. Aye. All those opposed, no. No. In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it. The amendment is not agreed to.
I call for a
Recorded vote.
Schakowsky calls for a recorded vote. We'll honor that, but we're going to roll the recorded votes per our agreement to the end of the markup. The committee will now proceed to the consideration of H.R. 8343, another improper payment reform, referred to as the Enhancing Improper Payment Accountability Act, sponsored by our Budget Committee colleague, Mr. Blake Moore of Utah, and a Democrat colleague of ours, Ms. Abigail Spanberger. The legislation addresses wasteful spending by codifying GAO program integrity recommendations for new federal programs, dispensing more than $100 million annually in any of their first 3 years of operation. It also addresses improper payments in current programs by requiring that agencies report on fraud risk management efforts annually and directing the president's budget request to include details on the program that are required to report on improper payments but don't do it. I ask unanimous consent for the first reading of the bill to be dispensed with, the bill be considered as read, and open amendment at any point, and that the reading of any amendments be dispensed with. Without objection, so ordered. Under the bipartisan agreement, again, we'll have 15 minutes evenly divided to consider and discuss H.R. 8343. I now recognize the sponsor of the bill, Mr. Blake Moore from Utah, for 7.5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman. Before I get to some of my prepared remarks, as I've listened to a lot of what we're talking about, I want to make a point that, and I do it in the effort of highlighting, like, these should be bipartisan issues. And I've got some data in here that I'm going to share in a minute where I go back to 2003. So from 2003 to today, we're talking, we've all had our party in the White House. By bringing these bills to the floor today, to committee, we are admitting that this has gone on during 2 different Republican administrations, 2 different Democratic administrations, and that we're fully aware this is a massive problem, and if we can't target waste, fraud, and abuse, we will never be able to deal with our debt and deficit woes. And there is low-hanging fruit here that I hope that we can at least today, maybe not fully, I don't know how these votes are going to play out as we do them in a minute, but sincerely look at the co-sponsorships of this and sincerely recognize that this has been a problem across this town for decades. And we've got to be able to target that. That's a sincere thank you to my Democratic colleagues that are co-sponsoring these, that are putting their neck out as they're in the minority currently. It's always a tough play, as the chairman mentioned earlier, but it is a sincere effort from our part. And I thank the chairman for being able to get this out here. My colleague from Indiana and so many others, General Bergman as well. Like, we don't fix the process and we don't fix the low-hanging fruit, we'll never be able to get after the major problems of our debt to GDP ratio, which is continuing to climb. So again, thank you for holding this important markup, Chairman. To consider these solutions to reduce improper payments, to root out waste, fraud, and abuse in our federal spending. We've got to be able to come together on this. As our debt continues to skyrocket, we owe it to the American people to steward every dollar as efficiently and effectively as possible for its intended use. And I'm pleased that my Enhancing Improper Payment Accountability Act was included in today's markup. I was proud to introduce this bipartisan legislation alongside my colleague, Congresswoman Abigail Spanberger of Virginia, with whom I've had the opportunity to work on improper payment issues over the last few years. Mr. Chairman, I ask unanimous consent to submit into the record letters and statements of support from various organizations and individuals as part of H.R. 8343. These include Audient Group, BPC Action, Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget, LexisNexis Risk Solutions, National Taxpayers Union Foundation, and Taxpayers Protection Alliance.
With that objection, so ordered.
Thank you. In addition to these groups, this bill is also supported by the Utah Taxpayer Association and the Project on Government Oversight. As my colleagues know, it is critical that Congress and the executive branch address improper payments. Since 2003, as I've just mentioned, the federal government has made $2.7 trillion in improper payments. And in fiscal year FY 2023 alone, 14 federal agencies reported a total of $236 billion in improper payments across 71 government programs. This creates programmatic inefficiencies and ultimately affects the people these programs are intended to help. As Congress has created new programs and federal spending grows, so does the risk of improper payments. Annual improper payments have increased from $106 billion in fiscal year 2013 to $247 billion in fiscal year 2022. That's a 133% increase. To tackle this challenge, ensuring that new federal programs in particular have guardrails and strategies in place to reduce the risk of fraud can help address these increasing rates of improper payments. At times, agencies' internal controls for risk management don't highlight the susceptibility of new programs to significant financial waste, fraud, and abuse. A lack of permanent structural risk management practices for new federal spending programs leaves them even more vulnerable to significant improper payments. To reduce wasteful, fraudulent, and fraudulent spending in new programs, the Enhancing Proper Payment Accountability Act would codify GAO recommendations to designate all new federal spending programs that make more than $100 million in payments annually in the first 3 fiscal years as susceptible to significant improper payments in their initial 4 years of operation. Second, subject these programs to stringent and timely reporting requirements. And third, require that agencies report on anti-fraud controls and fraud risk management efforts in their annual financial reports to Congress. These are very, very simple things that can create a significant impact in finding, again, that low-hanging fruit. The Enhancing Proper Payment, this bill would also address data gaps that currently exist by directing the president's budget, the federal government's ultimate budgetary document that reports on executive branch agency spending, to disclose details on agencies and programs that are non-compliant with reporting requirements. Enacting clear and in-depth reporting standards will allow the federal government to have a more accurate understanding of the problems agencies face in obtaining and relaying improper payment data. All of this would support Congress and federal agencies in working towards preventing the occurrence of improper payments. These are good governance reforms that will increase transparency in agencies. I can't stress enough, this is not a messaging bill. This is actual teeth that has existed for decades, and this would help us root this issue out. I ask colleagues on both sides of the aisle to support this legislation to better steward our taxpayer dollars. And with that, I yield to the gentleman from Georgia, Dr. Ferguson.
I think my colleague from Utah said it very well. But bottom line, we both Republicans and Democrats should want to get at the cause, the root, and solve the problem of improper payments. And don't you think it's important that we do that before we ask our fellow Americans to pay one more dime in taxes? Don't you think it's important that we do that before we burden our business community, our innovators, our job creators, who are trying to be competitive on the global stage with one more cent of tax? Let's get at the waste, fraud, and abuse. Let's get at the improper payments. Let's do this the right way before we ask for more money from our fellow Americans. And by the way, if that money comes in, then we can have the right kind of debate over whether or not it should be spent on various programs or whether it should be put to deficit reduction. But billions upon billions of dollars going out the door incorrectly every year is something that has to stop. And I think it's important that it stops before we ask our fellow Americans to pony up another dime. With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
26 seconds. I appreciate the leadership, Mr. Blakemore, and your sincere extension of partnership to our Democrat colleagues. I couldn't agree more with you. If we can't tackle the low-hanging fruit of waste, which has increased under Republican and Democrat leadership, I have a hard time believing we're going to take on the more difficult issues to save this country from a debt crisis. With that, I yield to the gentlelady, 7.5 minutes.
Thank you. I support reducing improper payments. However, this bill does not accomplish that goal. As drafted, this would result in duplicative reporting and an increased emphasis on reporting rather than preventing improper payments. As drafted, this bill will not achieve the intended outcome of new programs identifying susceptibility timely. Instead, it will allow programs to not report until 1 year or later after initial program creation. As drafted, this bill requires additional and duplicative comprehensive annual reporting, risking obligating agency and OIG resources to repetitive efforts to confirm guidance that is already in place rather than focus on improper payments preventive efforts. Despite our signing onto this bipartisan budget initiative, the committee has no hearings, no fact-finding discussions, or partisan proposals to address substantive budget issues or improper payments. We should hold substantive hearings to examine these issues before rushing legislation. And instead of requiring OMP to put information in multiple places, we should let them build upon the success of reducing improper payments. Excluding three-time pandemic relief programs that were designed, implemented, and overwhelmingly administered at the onset of the pandemic in 2020, the fiscal year 2023 improper payment rate was 4%, the lowest level since 2014. I would be remiss to not point out Republicans' long-standing one-sided approach of blaming for our fiscal outlook. Republicans refuse to address the $625 billion tax gap, money that directly adds to our deficit. Republicans have the wrong impression about improper payments. Republicans suggest that fast savings can be achieved through eliminating improper payments and reducing government waste. But the improper payments include overpayments, underpayments, payments made to ineligible recipients, or even payments that weren't properly documented and do not represent an amount that can be recouped. With that, I yield 3 minutes to Representative Schakowsky from Illinois.
Thank you so much for yielding. Look, I think all of us do think that we want to reduce unnecessary government spending and overpayments. But I think that this legislation was missing the boat on so many fronts that could have added to make sure that we could reduce the kind of unnecessary spending we have. That's why I wanted to introduce the legislation about how much we spend on prescription drugs. So my colleague who was saying that, we should work in a bipartisan way, I don't disagree, but I think we have to make sure that all of the issues that really add to overspending be included in a piece of legislation like this. And that is why I intend to vote no, because I think it really cut short the many things that we could be doing, and I'm hoping at some point we will be able to get together in talking about those things that should be included when we talk about overpayments and improper payments. And with that, I want to also express some, some friendship and support with many of my colleagues, but I think we could have done a much better job. And with that, I yield back.
I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Seeing that there are no amendments, I will now recognize the gentleman from Indiana for a motion.
Mr. Chairman, I move that H.R. 8343 be reported to the House with the recommendation that the bill do pass.
The question is on favorably reporting the bill. All those in favor will signify by saying aye. All those opposed, no. Opinion of the chair, the ayes have it.
Mr. Chairman, on that, I request a recorded vote.
Recorded vote has been requested. Pursuant to the bipartisan agreement I've reached with Ranking Member Mr. Boyle, we'll postpone the recorded vote until later in the markup. And the committee will now vote on postponed recorded votes. First, the committee will vote to report H.R. 8341. The clerk will call a roll.
Vote number 1 on favorably reporting without amendment H.R. 8341, the Cost Estimates Improvement Act. Mr. Norman. Mr. Norman. Mr. McClintock. Mr. McClintock. Mr. Grothman. Mr. Grothman, aye. Mr. Smucker. Mr. Smucker, aye. Mr. Burgess. Mr. Burgess, aye. Mr. Carter. Mr. Carter. Mr. Klein. Mr. Klein. Mr. Good. Mr. Good. Mr. Bergman. Mr. Bergman, aye. Mr. Ferguson. Mr. Ferguson, aye. Mr. Roy. Mr. Roy. Mr. Moore. Mr. Moore, aye. Mr. Valadeo. Mr. Valadeo, aye. Mr. Estes. Mr. Estes, aye. Miss McLean. Miss McLean. Miss Fishbach. Miss Fishbach, aye. Mr. Yocum. Mr. Yocum, aye. Mr. Burkeen. Mr. Burkeen, aye. Mr. Edwards. Mr. Edwards, aye. Miss Omar. Miss Omar, no. Miss Schakowsky. Miss Schakowsky, no. Mr. Blumenauer. Mr. Blumenauer, no. Mr. Kildee. Mr. Kildee, no. Mr. Peters. Mr. Peters, aye. Miss Lee. Miss Lee. Mr. Doggett. Mr. Doggett. Mr. Panetta. Mr. Panetta, aye. Miss Wexton. Miss Wexton. Miss Jackson Lee. Miss Jackson Lee. Mr. Trone. Mr. Trone. Miss Ballant. Miss Ballant, no. Mr. Scott. Mr. Scott, no. Mr. Espaillat? Mr. Espaillat? No. Mr. Boyle? Mr. Boyle? Mr. Chairman? Mr. Chairman, aye. Mr. Chair, Mr. Carter is not reported. Mr. Carter, aye. Mr. Roy is not recorded.
Aye.
Mr. Roy, aye. Mr. Chair, on the vote, the ayes are 17 and the noes are 7.
Is ordered to report. Ask unanimous consent that Mr. Klein be, it's too late, okay. The clerk will continue with the report. The ayes have it, the motion is agreed to. H.R. 8341 is reported to the House with a favorable recommendation. I note for the record that a quorum is present. The committee will now vote to report H.R. 8195. Clerk will call a roll.
On favorably reporting without amendment, H.R. 8195, the Strengthening Administrative Pay-As-You-Go Act of 2024. Mr. Norman. Mr. Norman. Mr. McClintock. Mr. McClintock. Mr. Grothman. Mr. Grothman, aye. Mr. Smucker. Mr. Smucker, aye. Mr. Burgess.
Burgess votes aye.
Mr. Burgess, aye. Mr. Carter. Mr. Carter, aye. Mr. Klein. Mr. Klein, aye. Mr. Good. Mr. Good. Mr. Bergman. Mr. Bergman, aye. Mr. Ferguson. Mr. Ferguson, aye. Mr. Roy. Mr. Roy, aye. Mr. Moore. Mr. Moore, aye. Mr. Valadeo. Mr. Valadeo, aye. Mr. Estes. Mr. Estes, aye. Miss McLean. Miss McLean. Miss Fishbach. Miss Fishbach, aye. Mr. Yocum. Mr. Yocum, aye. Mr. Burkeen. Mr. Burkeen. Mr. Burkeen, aye. Mr. Edwards. Mr. Edwards, aye. Miss Omar. Miss Omar, no. Miss Schakowsky. Miss Schakowsky, no. Mr. Blumenauer. Mr. Blumenauer, no. Mr. Kildee. Mr. Kildee, no. Mr. Peters. Mr. Peters, no. Miss Lee. Miss Lee. Mr. Doggett. Mr. Doggett. Mr. Panetta. Mr. Panetta, no. Miss Wexton. Miss Wexton. Miss Jackson Lee. Miss Jackson Lee. Mr. Trone. Mr. Trone. Miss Ballant. Miss Ballant, no. Mr. Scott. Mr. Scott, no. Mr. Espaillat. Mr. Espaillat, no. Mr. Boyle. Mr. Boyle. Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, aye. Mr. Chair, on the vote, there were 16 ayes and 9 noes.
Order reported to the House with a favorable recommendation. Before moving to the postponed recorded vote for 8372, without objection, I'd like to submit into the record letters and statements of support from various organizations, individuals as part of HR 8372. These include Americans for Prosperity, Competitive Enterprise Institute, National Taxpayers Union Foundation, and Taxpayer Protection Alliance. Without objection, so ordered. The committee will now vote to report HR 8372 as amended. The clerk will call a roll.
Mr. Norman. Mr. Norman. Mr. McClintock. Mr. McClintock. Mr. Grothman. Mr. Grothman, aye. Mr. Smucker. Mr. Smucker, aye. Mr. Burgess. Mr. Burgess, aye. Mr. Carter. Mr. Carter, aye. Mr. Klein. Mr. Klein, aye. Mr. Good. Mr. Good. Mr. Bergman. Mr. Bergman, aye. Mr. Ferguson. Mr. Ferguson, aye. Mr. Roy. Mr. Roy, aye. Mr. Moore. Mr. Moore, aye. Mr. Valadeo. Mr. Valadeo, aye. Mr. Estes. Mr. Estes, aye. Ms. McLean. Ms. McLean. Ms. Fishbach. Ms. Fishbach, aye. Mr. Yocum. Mr. Yocum, aye. Mr. Burkeen. Mr. Burkeen, aye. Mr. Edwards. Mr. Edwards, aye. Ms. Omar. Ms. Omar, aye. Ms. Schakowsky. Ms. Schakowsky, no. Mr. Blumenauer. Mr. Blumenauer, no. Mr. Kildee. Mr. Kildee, aye. Mr. Peters. Mr. Peters, aye. Ms. Lee. Ms. Lee. Mr. Doggett. Mr. Doggett. Mr. Panetta. Mr. Panetta, aye. Ms. Wexton. Ms. Wexton. Ms. Jackson Lee. Ms. Jackson Lee. Mr. Trone. Mr. Trone. Ms. Ballant. Ms. Ballant, aye. Mr. Scott. Mr. Scott, no. Mr. Espaillat. Mr. Espaillat, no. Mr. Boyle. Mr. Boyle. Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, aye. Mr. Chair, on the vote, the ayes are 21 and the noes are 4.
In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The motion is agreed to. HR 8372 as amended is ordered reported to the House with a favorable recommendation. Pursuant to the bipartisan agreement, we will now complete consideration of HR 8342. The committee will now vote on all postponed recorded votes on amendments to HR 8342. The committee will now vote on amendment number 3 offered by Ms. Omar. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Norman. Mr. Norman. Mr. McClintock. Mr. McClintock. Mr. Grothman. Mr. Grothman, no. Mr. Smucker. Mr. Smucker, no. Mr. Burgess.
Votes no.
Mr. Burgess, no. Mr. Carter. Mr. Carter, no. Mr. Klein. Mr. Klein, no. Mr. Good. Mr. Good. Mr. Bergman. Mr. Bergman, no. Mr. Ferguson. Mr. Ferguson, no. Mr. Roy. Mr. Roy, no. Mr. Moore. Mr. Moore, no. Mr. Valadeo. Mr. Valadeo, no. Mr. Estes. Mr. Estes, no. Ms. McLean. Ms. McLean. Ms. Fishbach. Ms. Fishbach, no. Mr. Yocum. Mr. Yocum, no. Mr. Burkeen. Mr. Burkeen. Mr. Burkeen, no. Mr. Edwards. Mr. Edwards, no. Ms. Omar. Ms. Omar, aye. Ms. Schakowsky. Ms. Schakowsky, aye. Mr. Blumenauer. Mr. Blumenauer, aye. Mr. Kildee. Mr. Kildee, aye. Mr. Peters. Mr. Peters, aye. Ms. Lee. Ms. Lee. Mr. Doggett. Mr. Doggett. Mr. Panetta. Mr. Panetta, aye. Miss Wexton, Miss Wexton, Miss Jackson Lee, Miss Jackson Lee, Mr. Trone, Mr. Trone, Miss Ballant, Miss Ballant, aye. Mr. Scott, Mr. Scott, aye. Mr. Espaillat, Mr. Espaillat, aye. Mr. Boyle, Mr. Boyle, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Chairman, no.
Your vote? If not, the clerk will report.
Mr. Chair, on the vote, the ayes are 9 and the noes are 16.
In opinion of the chair, the noes have it, and the amendment is not agreed to. The committee will now vote on amendment number 4, offered by Ms. Schakowsky. The clerk will call a roll.
Mr. Norman, Mr. Norman, Mr. McClintock, Mr. McClintock, Mr. Grothman. Mr. Grothman, no. Mr. Smucker, Mr. Smucker, no. Mr. Burgess,
Votes no.
Mr. Burgess, no. Mr. Carter, Mr. Carter, no. Mr. Klein, Mr. Klein, Mr. Good, Mr. Good, Mr. Bergman, Mr. Bergman, no. Mr. Ferguson, Mr. Ferguson, no. Mr. Roy, Mr. Roy, no. Mr. Moore, Mr. Moore, no. Mr. Valadeo, Mr. Valadeo, Mr. Estes, Mr. Estes, no. Miss McLean, Miss McLean, Miss Fishbach, Miss Fishbach, no. Mr. Yocum, Mr. Yocum, no. Mr. Burkeen, Mr. Burkeen, no. Mr. Edwards, Mr. Edwards, no. Miss Omar, Miss Omar, aye. Miss Schakowsky, Miss Schakowsky, aye. Mr. Blumenauer, Mr. Blumenauer, aye. Mr. Kildee, Mr. Kildee, aye. Mr. Peters, Mr. Peters, no. Miss Lee, Miss Lee, Mr. Doggett, Mr. Doggett, Mr. Panetta, Mr. Panetta, aye. Miss Wexton, Miss Wexton, Miss Jackson Lee, Miss Jackson Lee, Mr. Trone, Mr. Trone, Miss Ballant, Miss Ballant, aye. Mr. Scott, Mr. Scott, aye. Mr. Espaillat, Mr. Espaillat, aye. Mr. Boyle, Mr. Boyle, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Chairman, no. Mr. Klein, Mr. Klein, no.
Voted. Does any member wish to change their vote? If not, the clerk shall report.
Mr. Chair, on the vote, the ayes are 8 and the noes are 16.
Opinion of the chair, the noes have it. The amendment is not agreed to. Would now like to recognize the gentleman from Indiana, Mr. Yackum, for a motion.
Mr. Chairman, I move that H.R. 8342 be reported to the House with the recommendation that the bill do pass.
The question is on favorably reporting the bill. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Those opposed, no. No. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it.
Mr. Chairman, I ask for a recorded vote.
Recorded vote has been requested. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Norman, Mr. Norman, Mr. McClintock, Mr. McClintock, Mr. Grothman, Mr. Grothman, aye. Mr. Smucker, Mr. Smucker, aye. Mr. Burgess, Mr. Burgess, aye. Mr. Carter, Mr. Carter, aye. Mr. Klein, Mr. Klein, aye. Mr. Good, Mr. Good, Mr. Bergman, Mr. Bergman, aye. Mr. Ferguson, Mr. Ferguson, aye. Mr. Roy, Mr. Roy, aye. Mr. Moore, Mr. Moore, aye. Mr. Valadeo, Mr. Valadeo, Mr. Valadeo, aye. Mr. Estes, Mr. Estes, aye. Miss McLean, Miss McLean, Miss Fishbach, Miss Fishbach, aye. Mr. Yocum, Mr. Yocum, aye. Mr. Burkeen, Mr. Burkeen, aye. Mr. Edwards, Mr. Edwards, aye. Miss Omar, Miss Omar, no. Miss Schakowsky, Miss Schakowsky, no. Mr. Blumenauer, Mr. Blumenauer, no. Mr. Kildee, Mr. Kildee, no. Mr. Peters, Mr. Peters, aye. Miss Lee, Miss Lee, Mr. Doggett, Mr. Doggett, Mr. Panetta, Mr. Panetta, aye. Ms. Wexton, Ms. Wexton, Ms. Jackson Lee, Ms. Jackson Lee, Mr. Trone, Mr. Trone, Ms. Ballant, no. Mr. Scott, Mr. Scott, no. Mr. Espaillat, Mr. Espaillat, no. Mr. Boyle, Mr. Boyle, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Chairman, aye.
Does any member wish to change their vote? If not, the clerk shall report.
Mr. Chair, on the vote, the ayes are 18 and the noes are 7.
Opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the motion is agreed to. H.R. 8342 is reported to the House with a favorable recommendation. The committee now will vote to report H.R. 8343. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Norman, Mr. Norman, Mr. McClintock, Mr. McClintock, Mr. Grothman, Mr. Grothman, aye. Mr. Smucker, Mr. Smucker, aye. Mr. Burgess,
Votes aye.
Mr. Burgess, aye. Mr. Carter, Mr. Carter, aye. Mr. Klein, Mr. Klein, aye. Mr. Good, Mr. Good, Mr. Bergman, Mr. Bergman, aye. Mr. Ferguson, Mr. Ferguson, aye. Mr. Roy, Mr. Roy, aye. Mr. Moore, Mr. Moore, aye. Mr. Valadeo, Mr. Valadeo, aye. Mr. Estes, Mr. Estes, aye. Ms. McLean, Ms. McLean, Ms. Fishbach, Ms. Fishbach, aye. Mr. Yocum, Mr. Yocum, aye. Mr. Burkeen, Mr. Burkeen, aye. Mr. Edwards, Mr. Edwards, aye. Ms. Omar, Ms. Omar, no. Ms. Schakowsky, Ms. Schakowsky, no. Mr. Blumenauer, Mr. Blumenauer, no. Mr. Kildee, Mr. Kildee, no. Mr. Peters, Mr. Peters, aye. Miss Lee, Miss Lee, Mr. Doggett, Mr. Doggett, Mr. Panetta, Mr. Panetta, aye. Miss Wexton, Miss Wexton, Miss Jackson Lee, Miss Jackson Lee, Mr. Trone, Mr. Trone, Miss Ballant, Miss Ballant, no. Mr. Scott, Mr. Scott, no. Mr. Espaillat, Mr. Espaillat, no. Mr. Boyle, Mr. Boyle, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Chairman, aye.
If not, the clerk shall report.
Mr. Chair, on the vote, the ayes are 18 and the noes are 7.
The opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the motion is agreed to. H.R. 8343 is reported to the House with a favorable recommendation. Without objection, staff are authorized to make necessary technical and conforming changes to the bills. So ordered.
Mr. Chairman, I request the requisite number of days to submit minority views.
Without objection, so ordered. Again, I would like to thank Ranking Member Omar and Ranking Member Boyle, their staff, for the cooperation with today's markup. This completes the committee's business for today, and the committee stands adjourned.